In the scorching desert of Nevada, a multi-million-dollar military helicopter sat silent and broken while generals panicked. The solution wasn't found in advanced technology or elite specialists. It came from a man everyone had overlooked, whose weathered hands held secrets that could save lives. The Nevada sun blazed mercilessly over Nellis Air Force Base as Major Sarah Collins stared at the motionless Black Hawk helicopter. Its rotors hung lifeless against the cloudless sky, and the million-dollar machine that should have been roaring to life sat as silent as a grave. The rescue mission to extract wounded soldiers from a training exercise had been aborted 3 times, and time was running out. "Ma'am, we've tried everything," Sergeant Rodriguez reported, sweat beading on his forehead. "The engines won't turn over. Our best mechanics are stumped." Collins felt the weight of responsibility crushing her shoulders. Somewhere out in the desert, soldiers were counting on this helicopter. The backup aircraft was hours away, and every minute that passed increased the risk to lives that hung in the balance. Before continuing, hit that like button and subscribe to discover more stories of heroes who don't wear their valor on their sleeves, because sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in plain sight. The base's maintenance hangar buzzed with frustrated activity. Young technicians with the latest diagnostic equipment had been working since dawn, their faces etched with defeat. Colonel Harrison paced nearby, barking orders into his radio while sweat stained his uniform. The pressure from Washington was mounting. This wasn't just any training exercise, but a high-profile demonstration for foreign military officials. "Get me someone who knows these birds inside and out," Harrison commanded. That's when Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh remembered something. "Sir, there's Tom Bennett. He worked on helicopters in Vietnam, been fixing aircraft longer than most of us have been alive." Harrison's face twisted with impatience. "I need experts, not some old-timer telling war stories." But as another hour passed with no progress, desperation began to override pride. Bennett worked quietly in the far corner of the hangar, ignored by the younger staff who saw him as nothing more than a relic from another era. At 68, his hands were gnarled from decades of mechanical work. His uniform faded and patched, and his quiet demeanor made him practically invisible among the bustling activity. Tom had arrived at Nellis 3 years ago, taking a civilian contractor position after retiring from a small-town garage. He'd seen combat in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where helicopters meant the difference between life and death, where mechanical failure wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. But here on the base, he was just another aging maintenance worker, overlooked and undervalued. As the crisis deepened, Tom watched the frantic efforts with patient eyes. He'd seen this kind of panic before, in situations where panic killed more soldiers than enemy fire. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the loudest voices and the newest equipment couldn't replace experience and intuition, the kind that came from crawling through mud under fire to fix a helicopter with nothing but determination and ingenuity. The base commander's voice crackled over the radio. "I don't care if you have to call in a miracle worker, get that bird in the air." Little did anyone know that their miracle worker was already there, quietly waiting in the shadows, his weathered hands holding the key to saving the day. Tom Bennett had spent a lifetime being underestimated, but today would prove that true expertise doesn't come with fanfare. It comes with scars, wisdom, and the quiet confidence of someone who's faced impossible odds and won. The morning stretched into afternoon as the temperature soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the hangar, frustration reached a boiling point. Master Sergeant Kelly Thompson, the lead mechanic, threw down his wrench in defeat. "The diagnostics show everything's fine, but she won't start. It's like the birds playing dead." Colonel Harrison's patience had evaporated with the desert heat. "Gentlemen, I have a 3-star general breathing down my neck and foreign dignitaries questioning American military capabilities. Figure this out." In the background, Tom Bennett methodically cleaned his tools, listening to every word. He'd spent the morning observing the chaos, noting the systematic approaches the young mechanics were taking. They were good, better trained than he'd ever been, but they were missing something crucial. Experience had taught him that helicopters, especially older models, had personalities, quirks that no manual could explain. Staff Sergeant Walsh approached him hesitantly. "Tom, I know you've got years on these machines. Any thoughts?" Tom looked up from his toolbox, his weathered face thoughtful. "Well, Jennifer, I've been watching these boys work. They're doing everything by the book." He paused, glancing toward the stubborn Black Hawk. "Sometimes the book doesn't know everything." "What do you mean?" "This particular bird, tail number 8 to 7 to 4 to 2 to 1, she's got some history. Built in '89, saw action in the Gulf, then Afghanistan. She's been rebuilt more times than a hot rod." Tom stood slowly, his joints protesting. "Helicopters like this, they develop habits. Mechanical memory, you might call it." Walsh frowned. Mechanical memory. After years of hard use, metal fatigue creates invisible problems. The new diagnostic equipment can't see what experience knows. Tom walked toward the helicopter, his practiced eye scanning details others missed. "See how she's sitting? Left skids about a quarter-inch lower. That means the main rotor assembly's slightly out of alignment, not enough to show on computers, but enough to prevent proper startup sequence." The younger mechanics overheard and exchanged skeptical glances. Specialist Davis, fresh from technical school, scoffed quietly. "Old guy thinks he can eyeball problems that million-dollar equipment can't detect." But Walsh had seen enough military operations to know that wisdom often came in unexpected packages. "Tom, what would you do?" "First, I'd check the collective pitch linkage. These older birds, when they've been sitting in heat like this, the hydraulic fluid thickens just enough to prevent proper calibration." Tom pointed to a seemingly insignificant valve. "Then I'd look at the fuel flow regulator, not the main line, but the secondary bypass that feeds the starter turbine." Master Sergeant Thompson overheard and approached, his expression a mixture of curiosity and desperation. "You think it's that simple?" Tom's eyes held the steady confidence of someone who'd fixed helicopters while under enemy fire. "Simple? No, Sergeant, but sometimes complicated problems have simple solutions that get overlooked because we're looking too hard for complex answers. The Colonel's not going to let some civilian contractor touch this bird without authorization," Thompson warned. "Then maybe," Tom said quietly, "someone should ask the Colonel if he'd rather have a working helicopter or perfect paperwork." As if summoned by their conversation, Colonel Harrison strode over, his face red with heat and frustration. "I heard chatter about new ideas. At this point, I'm willing to listen to anyone." Tom straightened, his military bearing still evident despite his civilian clothes. "Sir, with respect, I'd like to take a look at your bird. Sometimes fresh eyes, even old ones, see what others miss." Harrison studied the older man, noting the quiet confidence, the way he stood despite his age. Something about Bennett reminded him of the seasoned NCOs who'd kept him alive during his own combat tour. "You have 5 minutes, Bennett. After that, we're shipping this bird to depot maintenance." 5 minutes to prove that experience could triumph over technology, that wisdom earned in combat could solve problems that stumped the digital age. Tom Bennett approached the Black Hawk with the reverence of someone who understood that helicopters were more than machines. They were lifelines, the difference between soldiers coming home or not. His weathered hands traced the aircraft's surface, feeling for vibrations, temperature differences, the subtle signs that spoke to those who knew how to listen. "This is nuts," muttered Specialist Davis. "We've had a team of certified technicians working on this for 6 hours." Colonel Harrison checked his watch. 4 minutes, Bennett." Tom nodded and opened his modest toolbox, a battered metal case that had followed him from Vietnam to countless civilian jobs. Inside were tools worn smooth by decades of use, instruments that had fixed everything from combat helicopters to farm equipment. While the young mechanics relied on computer diagnostics worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, Tom trusted his senses and experience. He placed his hand on the engine housing and closed his eyes, feeling the metal's temperature and texture. Then he moved to the rotor assembly, running his fingers along connection points that the diagnostic equipment had declared perfect. Here, he said quietly, pointing to what appeared to be a standard hydraulic coupling. This connection's been over-torqued, probably happened during the last maintenance cycle. The gaskets compressed beyond specification, not enough to leak, but enough to create back pressure in the hydraulic system. Master Sergeant Thompson frowned. The pressure readings are normal. Static pressure, yes. But when you try to start, the system can't build the dynamic pressure needed for rotor engagement. Tom reached into his toolbox and withdrew a simple wrench. May I, Colonel? Harrison glanced at his watch. 2 minutes. With movements precise and deliberate, Tom loosened the coupling just slightly, a quarter turn that released nearly imperceptible pressure. Then he moved to the fuel system, his experienced eye spotting a filter housing that sat at a barely noticeable angle. This filter housing was installed with a slight twist, creates turbulence in the fuel flow, not enough to prevent running, but enough to interfere with the startup sequence. Another tool, another subtle adjustment. The new parts are manufactured to tighter tolerances than the originals. Sometimes perfect parts don't work perfectly in imperfect systems. The watching mechanics exchanged uncertain glances. These weren't the kinds of problems their training had prepared them for. They were the accumulated wisdom of someone who'd learned to fix things when failure meant death. 30 seconds, Harrison announced. Tom made one final adjustment to a seemingly unimportant valve near the engine intake. This bypass valve is sticking. In this heat, after sitting idle, it needs manual intervention to reset properly. He gently manipulated the valve until he felt the subtle click of proper alignment. He stepped back and wiped his hands on a faded shop rag. She should start now, Colonel. The hangar fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning units fighting the desert heat. Every eye focused on Tom Bennett, the overlooked civilian contractor who claimed to have solved problems that had stumped the military's best technicians. Colonel Harrison looked from Tom to the helicopter, then to his watch. Sergeant Rodriguez, fire her up. Rodriguez climbed into the pilot's seat, his movements careful and professional. The familiar pre-flight sequence began: switches, gauges, the methodical preparation that preceded every flight. The younger mechanics watched with barely concealed skepticism, while Tom stood quietly, his confidence unwavering. The starter turbine began to whine, a sound they'd heard dozens of times that morning without success. But this time something was different. The whine built steadily, reaching the pitch that should trigger main engine ignition. Then, like a sleeping giant awakening, the Black Hawk's engines roared to life. The rotor blades began their familiar rotation, slowly at first, then building to operational speed. The helicopter that had sat silent and broken for hours now filled the hangar with the powerful rhythm of perfectly synchronized machinery. The silence that followed the initial startup was profound. Then Master Sergeant Thompson began to clap, followed by the other mechanics, and finally by Colonel Harrison himself. Tom Bennett had done the impossible, not through technology or textbook knowledge, but through the irreplaceable wisdom of experience. The sound of the Black Hawk's rotors filled the hangar like thunder, drowning out the stunned silence of everyone who had witnessed Tom Bennett's quiet miracle. Colonel Harrison stood transfixed, watching the helicopter that had been declared unfixable now running as smoothly as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. "Sir," Rodriguez's voice crackled through the headset, "all systems green. She's running perfectly." The rescue mission that had been delayed for hours could finally proceed. Within minutes, the Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac, carrying medical personnel toward the training site where injured soldiers waited. Tom watched from the hangar doorway as the aircraft disappeared into the desert sky, knowing that his simple adjustments had quite literally saved lives. Master Sergeant Thompson approached, his expression transformed from skepticism to amazement. "Tom, I owe you an apology. We all do. How did you know?" Tom closed his toolbox, the same unhurried movements he'd used for decades. Experience, Sergeant. Sometimes the most sophisticated equipment can't replace time and mistakes. Lots of mistakes that teach you how things really work. Colonel Harrison strode over, his uniform still damp with sweat, but his demeanor completely changed. Bennett, I need to ask, what's your background, really? 68th Assault Helicopter Company, Vietnam, 68 to 70. Then 20 years fixing civilian aircraft, 15 years at a small-town garage, and the last 3 years here. Tom's voice remained modest despite the miracle he'd just performed. I've probably fixed more broken helicopters than most people have seen. And we had you organizing supply closets, Harrison muttered, shaking his head. This is unacceptable. Young Specialist Davis approached hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. Mr. Bennett, how did you know about the hydraulic coupling? Our diagnostic equipment showed normal pressure. Tom smiled, the first real warmth he'd shown all day. Son, diagnostic equipment tells you what's happening right now. Experience tells you what's going to happen next, and more importantly, what happened before that created the current situation. He pointed toward the now empty spot where the helicopter had been. That bird has been repaired and rebuilt so many times that her original specifications don't quite match her current reality. New parts on old frames, updated systems interfacing with original components. The computers see everything as separate systems, but a helicopter is one integrated machine where everything affects everything else. Staff Sergeant Walsh, who had first suggested consulting Tom, felt vindicated. So what do we do differently going forward? Before Tom could answer, the hangar's main doors opened and a black sedan with official plates pulled up. A 3-star general emerged, followed by several foreign military officials who had come to observe American maintenance capabilities. General Morrison had flown in from Washington specifically to address the crisis. He'd expected to find failure, embarrassment, and explanations for why American military technology couldn't be kept operational. Instead, he found a perfectly functioning operation and a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about military efficiency. Colonel Harrison quickly briefed the general, explaining how a civilian contractor had solved problems that had stumped their best personnel. Morrison listened intently, his experienced eye taking in the details of both the situation and the man who had resolved it. Mr. Bennett, General Morrison said, extending his hand, I understand you've had quite a morning. Tom shook the general's hand with the same quiet confidence he'd shown throughout the crisis. Just doing my job, General. Your job is supply inventory, according to your personnel file. Yes, sir, but sometimes jobs expand based on what needs doing. General Morrison smiled, recognizing the understated competence he'd seen in the best NCOs throughout his career. How would you feel about a job expansion, something more substantial? The foreign officials observed this exchange with interest, taking notes about American military flexibility and the value placed on experience. They had come expecting to see advanced technology. Instead, they were witnessing something more profound, an organization that could recognize and utilize expertise regardless of where it was found. Tom considered the offer carefully. At 68, he hadn't expected any more career changes, but looking around the hangar at the young faces watching him with newfound respect, he realized that his most important work might still lie ahead. 3 months later, the Nellis Air Force Base hangar looked remarkably different. What had once been a purely high-tech operation now balanced sophisticated diagnostic equipment with the wisdom of experience. Tom Bennett, now bearing the title of Senior Technical Consultant, stood before a group of young mechanics, sharing knowledge that no manual could contain. Remember, Tom explained to the attentive faces, every helicopter tells a story. Your job is to listen to what she's saying. He gestured toward a Black Hawk, identical to the one that had launched his transformation from overlooked contractor to respected mentor. The vibration in the tail rotor doesn't just mean bearing wear, it tells you about the pilot's flying habits, the terrain she's been working, even the weather conditions she's encountered. Specialist Davis, now one of Tom's most eager students, raised his hand. Mr. Bennett, how do you develop that kind of intuition? Time, mistakes, and paying attention to what the aircraft teaches you, Tom replied. But mostly, you have to care about more than just fixing machines. You have to understand that someone's life depends on your work. The transformation at Nellie's had attracted attention throughout the military. General Morrison had instituted a program pairing experienced civilian contractors with young military technicians, recognizing that wisdom and technology combined created capabilities neither possessed alone. Tom's success had become a model replicated at bases nationwide. Master Sergeant Thompson, now Tom's official military liaison, reviewed the morning's training schedule. We've got representatives from 3 other bases coming next week to observe the program. Good, Tom nodded. But remember, this isn't about one person or one success story. It's about recognizing that experience has value, even when it comes in unexpected packages. The program had evolved beyond simple maintenance training. Tom worked with pilots, helping them understand their aircraft's quirks and capabilities. He consulted on modifications, bridging the gap between engineering specifications and operational reality. Most importantly, he had created a culture where questions were valued over assumptions, where admitting uncertainty was seen as wisdom rather than weakness. Colonel Harrison, now a strong advocate for the program, often brought visiting officials to observe Tom's unconventional teaching methods. 6 months ago, we were slaves to diagnostic equipment, he would explain. Now we use technology as a tool while trusting human insight and experience. The rescue mission that had started everything had concluded successfully, with all injured personnel recovered safely. But that single flight had generated ripple effects throughout the military maintenance community. Tom's simple adjustments had prevented what could have been a tragic failure, but more importantly, they had opened minds to the value of overlooked expertise. Late in the afternoon, as the desert heat began to subside, Tom found himself alone in the hangar with the same Black Hawk he had repaired months earlier. She had flown dozens of missions since then, each one successful, each one a testament to the principle that sometimes the most profound solutions come from the simplest wisdom. Staff Sergeant Walsh approached with a clipboard full of maintenance reports. Tom, we've got 3 more bases requesting consultation on aircraft that have stumped their crews. Tom smiled, thinking about the